Actor Spotlight. Roger Moore. This week the actor spotlight shines on Roger Moore, the actor most famous for playing James Bond 007 in 7 films from 1973 to 1985. Of course, Uncle Roger was famous before that on the small screen, almost as iconic as the 60s Simon Templar, aka Le Saint, in the 60s before shooting to big screen stardom as the definitive version of James Bond, and I'm going to take a look at his Bond films as well as a couple of his other gems in this review. Moore took over the role as Bond with Live and Let Die, following an earlier failed attempt to replace Sean Connery with the deathly dull and charmless George Lazenby, an Australian who had been given a terminal charisma bypass from which he never recovered. I have to be honest here, as much as I love Sean Connery as an actor outside of Bond, I've never really been his biggest fan in the role, and I dare say it doesn't help that most of his pictures seem terribly slow, dated, stilted and dare I say it, yes of course I do, fucking boring in this day and age. Fortunately the Bond franchise hits high gear when Uncle Roger arrives. I grew up with Roger Moore and he remains the best for me. To be honest, I don't really care much for the Bond movies outside of his era at all. The Brosnans are as shit gets, and the Craig movies are inspired cures for insomnia, loved by the kind of anal joyless fucks who think the Nolan Batman movies are good tee-hee chuckle guffaw titter. Now don't get me wrong, I do actually quite like the Dalton movies, particularly the frankly awesome License to Kill, which is more like a very 80s blood-soaked revenge thriller than the standard Bond caper, but beyond that I don't really give much of a monkey's fuck. Bond is all about Uncle Roger as far as I'm concerned. Rog did have a couple of big screen efforts before Bond, the most notable of which is the excellent The Man Who Haunted Himself. I just reviewed this in my top 15 70s horror flicks so I won't go into it again, but it's an excellent little creepy movie I think warrants a straight A. Anyway, the first Moore Bond film is Live and Let Die. Investigating the deaths of 3 agents, James Bond uncovers an elaborate Caribbean, New York heroin smuggling operation hiding behind the superstitious veneer of a voodoo cult. Roger Moore is instantly fantastic and iconic in his debut as 007 in this early 70s Bond flick, and while this isn't my favorite of his it's still great fun entertainment, with plenty of action and wit. It's Uncle Rog smooching the ladies and kicking bad guy ass. What more do you want? It's notable how smoothly Roger inhabits the role, especially given the self-consciousness in the introduction of Lazenby. There's no this wouldn't happen to the other guy style shit here, Roger is just instantly Bond. Sean fucking who? Live and Let Die gets a straight A from me. Moore's next Bond film was The Man with the Golden Gun, which sees Bond become the target of the world's most notorious assassin, Scaramanga, played by none other than Christopher Lee. Yes folks, it's Bond vs Dracula and why the hell not? Have to be honest, I haven't seen this one in about 15 years though I'm intending to redress that later this year now I've gotten the Blu-ray and seen all the others recently. I have very strong memories of this though, and have little doubt it's great, with a great villain and a wonderful henchman in Nick Nack, and I give it another straight A. The next Bond movie with the greatest Bond ever was The Spy Who Loved Me, which is not just the best Roger Moore Bond film, it's the best James Bond film of all time, period. Everything about this movie just oozes class and atmosphere. It's full of action, with a great baddie, a great Bond girl and the most iconic henchman villain in the entire series in the form of Richard Keel's steel-toothed jaws. This movie is fucking awesome and deserves nothing less than an A+. Next up was 1979's Moonraker. Moonraker is one of the most slagged films in the whole series, but you can probably guess what I think of the misericks cunts who do so. Frankly they very much remind me of the humorless bores who slag off the Fantastic Williams era of Tom Baker and Doctor Who, and both lots of crushing bores are equally full of shit in every regard. Not to say that Moonraker isn't one of the silliest Bond films ever, because it is. But it's also one of the most fucking fun and entertaining as well, something that might not matter to the homoerotic Daniel Craig lovers, but certainly does to me. I have a very fond memory of Moonraker, seeing it for the first time as junior school in the early, mid-80s at Christmas one year. The teachers paraded us into the assembly hall to watch a film, as they sometimes did, and it was usually twee Disney shite like bedrooms and broomsticks, which all us lads thought was kiddie shit, precocious little fucks that we were, only to actually show us a fucking James Bond movie. Best Christmas ever. We were all deeply pissed off the following year when instead of something equally cool like Star Wars or For Your Eyes Only we ended up with fucking Laurel and Hardy instead. Fuck a duck. Anyway, I digress, back to Moonraker. I hadn't seen it for a very long time until recently but loved every moment of it. It starts off normally enough but from the moment Jaws falls in love at first sight, complete with deliberately cliché, swelling music, possibly the funniest moment in any Bond movie ever, you start to get the distinct impression they're not exactly taking this one terribly seriously. The last half hour or so is gloriously OTT. I had a thoroughly good time and can give Moonraker nothing less than a well-deserved A+. Fuck the haters, fuck them hard. The next more Bond movie is For Your Eyes Only, which is a grittier and more serious film than Moonraker, but fortunately is still fun and entertaining, unlike the series' 21st century attempts at being so. For Your Eyes Only is in fact another absolutely classic film, with my personal favorite Bond girl ever in Carol Bouquet, who is as hot as fuck and a dab hand with a crossbow to boot. The very end, which has a memorable cameo from then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and her husband Dennis, is hated by the Misericts crowd, but who gives a fuck what they think, right? It makes me laugh like a fucking drain and is a perfect ending to another A+ Uncle Roger Bond film from me. Roger also has a great part in the comedy action flick Cannonball Run, playing a rich playboy who has great fun with the fact that he's a dead ringer for James Bond actor Roger Moore. It's a very funny turn in an entertaining enough B flick. Next up is Octopussy. This was the Roger Moore Bond that I have the least familiarity with. I don't recall seeing it as a kid, though I may have forgotten. Understandable if I did, and only vaguely recall seeing it about 20 years ago when my brother rented a Laserdisc copy of it, and having the vague feeling that it was a bit dull. Having seen it again, I can honestly say it's very dull. Octopussy is easily Roger's worst Bond, failing on almost every level. The plot is boring, the villains are boring, and the guy who should be the main villain, Steven Berkoff's mad Russian general who as it turns out, eventually, wants to set off a nuke inside the US, is barely in the film, and even the ladies are strikingly unmemorable. To be fair, the last 40 minutes are an improvement and have some decent action and excitement, but that doesn't excuse the first 90 for being so agonizingly boring. Honestly, until the 90-minute mark all the story seems to be about his counterfeit golden eggs. Who the fuck thought that was a compelling plot for anything, let alone a James Bond film? Having now sampled it again, I can see why it's the only more to have slipped entirely from my memory. It's almost as thrilling as your average Daniel Craig Bond movie. Octopussy gets a well-deserved D- from me. There was a point where it looked like this might be Roger's last Bond, as he thought he was getting a bit long in the tooth for it all. But the producers couldn't find anyone capable of replacing his majestic screen presence and charisma, and indeed still haven't 30-odd years later, so they persuaded him to come back for another one, and thank Christ they did is all I can say. One of Roger's last big screen roles outside Bond comes in the 1985 thriller The Naked Face, in which Uncle Roger's a shrink whose patients start getting bumped off and who suffers attempts on his own life. Roger's as great as ever, and there's a jaw-droppingly OTT performance from Rod Steiger as a spectacularly obnoxious cop. This is a solid enough thriller with a slightly underwhelming ending that I also give a B. Roger Moore's seventh and final outing as 007 is A View to a Kill, as Bond goes up against a mad industrialist, Christopher Walken on great scenery chewing form, who wants to corner the market on microchips and doesn't much care about killing millions of people by wiping out Silicon Valley to do it. What a loony. I really enjoyed this, a massive return to form after the freaking boring Octopussy, the only Moore I don't like, with solid support from Grace Jones as Walken's menacingly murderous henchwoman and the late, great Patrick Macnee stealing every scene he's in as Sir Godfrey. The chemistry between him and Moore when they go undercover on Walken's estate is great, and it's a real pity he gets killed off so early. Dana Roberts is a pretty lame Bond girl, though that's as much the script's fault as hers, as she only really shows up over an hour in and gets little to do, rather a disappointment after the Russian spy in, Holy Goodhead, lol, in Moonraker and the Vengeful Melina in For Your Eyes Only, but the movie has so many other pleasures to offer it doesn't bother me too much. There's loads of great action scenes and a thrilling last half hour, complete with memorable climax atop the Golden Gate Bridge. Huge fun and a great send-off for Uncle Rog. An A+ from me and no mistake. I love Roger Moore. One of my favorite actors and the definitive, unsurpassable James Bond with the best films in the entire franchise. I can give this legend nothing less than A+ himself.